Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, and we have you covered with a preview for Penn State's eighth matchup of the season. A long-awaited matchup that doesn't look exactly how we anticipated as we covered early in the week. Number one Ohio State awaits in Columbus for a noon kickoff on Saturday. Penn State heads out there riding a four-game losing streak coming out of its bye week, just like Ohio State is. Three-touchdown underdog are the Penn State Nittany Lions. We broke down Ohio State with Buckeyes reporter Patrick Murphy on our last episode of the show. I had a chance to spend a lot of time with him, not just on this Buckeyes team, but also on Brian Hartline a bit. So if you're really following along with our coaching search and you're pretty fascinated by what's happening there, some good commentary from Patrick Murphy on Brian Hartline, his presence in that facility for the Buckeyes, and maybe what he could look like as a CEO type if he took the next step as a head coach. We also broke down a whirlwind recruiting situation on our last episode with Tyler Calvaruso. It had been a couple of weeks since we had Tyler on to discuss Penn State recruiting. Much has happened, much of it not so fun, but we took a lot of time to break that down on our Wednesday episode of this podcast. So circle back, check that out. We're not going to spend much time on Ohio State, the team. We'll talk about the matchup for Penn State here along the way. And I just want to point out one more time, if you aren't with our coaching search, if you aren't staying updated, you're missing out on a lot of good stuff over there. 50% off gets you in the door, VIP access at lions247.com right now for an annual access on our site, or you can go monthly, 1 month, work it that way. It's a full price, but you get an immediate perk. You get Paramount Plus, the streaming platform included with your monthly subscription. So a couple ways to get in the door with us at Lions 24/7, 2 million views, 25,000 plus comments on our hot board of coaching candidates and all the message board thread that's attached to it. Matt Rule picked up an extension from Nebraska today, something we anticipated as this week was going on. I would say the overall sense is that's relief for Penn State fans that happened. We have recent updates on Mike Elko from Texas A&M, Brian Hartline, as I mentioned, Eli Drinkwitz from Missouri, and other names as well over on that board. But shifting focus toward the task at hand, and these guys will be making the trip out to Ohio on Friday for coverage on Saturday. Mark, Daniel, bringing you in. We got to begin with team mentality. Once again, I feel like we start our pregame coverage week by week with that conversation. But, Mark, it's going to ring true here because Ohio State will not hesitate to take you to the woodshed if you're not up for the moment when this thing kicks off noon Saturday. And so what are you most curious about? You guys will be on the field for pregame coverage. What do you want to pick up from this Penn State team to give you a sense that they're ready to play some ball?
The vibe we got from Terry Smith on Wednesday just seemed it was a little bit different than the previous ones. It's like he's kind of settled into this thing, and I guess I'm looking for that to kind of be projected onto the team. Out at Iowa, even though the team played with a lot of heart and dedicated desire, kind of get after it, we're probably beating that to death, but I do think it was a good sign. There was kind of a look of shock and stun, even after that game about what everybody had gone through. And I think now, given the bye week to digest it, I'm really anxious to see if this comes out and looks like the team we saw earlier in the season when they were being a little bit more successful. I hesitate to say a lot more successful because it was the level of competition that they were playing against, obviously. But I just want to see if it feels like it felt maybe kind of pre-James Franklin firing early in the season when everything seemed to be trending in the right direction, and if they have that kind of positive vibe. I'm not sure what our pre-game field access is. I haven't asked yet, but I will. I don't know if you checked on it yet, Daniel. I'm forgetting what it was last time we were there.
I think we've had access there at pregame in the past.
So if we get the access, we'll be down there, and you really do get a little bit better feel when you're actually down there, as opposed to Beaver Stadium, where I could get down there because I do some video stuff, but most reporters can't. But that is what I'm going to be looking for. And again, we've said this after I think every press conference since and every media availability. I think the players and coaches are all saying the right things. So, but it's going to be a different kind of thing, kind of living it against this caliber of opponent in that atmosphere. Although I said it earlier this week, I think that Iowa atmosphere is every bit as good as an Ohio State atmosphere.
Daniel, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I got the sense to Mark's point about Terry Smith maybe being a bit more settled and it coming off that way. I would agree there, but I think there's also feels like the players that we spoke with this week are past the mourning stage, past maybe that guilt phase, which is important because you want them to be focused on what they have in front of them, not what occurred behind them. But speaking with Luke Reynolds, for me personally, the tight end on the practice field yesterday, I know you were involved in speaking with Zion Tracy and Nolan Rucci, and earlier this week we had Ethan Grunkemeyer and Trevor Pena. It feels more like getting back to normal conversation, normal kind of attitude. I don't think they're faking it. I think it's just natural that they're now 16, 17, 18 days removed from James Franklin being fired. They had a bye week to kind of do an autopsy on what's not going right. They've clearly made some adjustments based on what we have heard. They've installed some new things offensively. We'll see how it pans out in the field. But were you picking up what I was, Daniel, in terms of these guys maybe the ball rolling forward and away from a very adverse situation earlier this month?
Definitely. I think the fact that you got to go out and play a game, if you're Penn State, get things out of your system that way, and then have a week to practice and maybe finally reset a little bit. Like we talked about, that Iowa week sounds like it was pretty hectic, a lot of moving parts, a lot of balls in the air. And then you had that week to settle in, to take a deep breath, to maybe relax a little bit, and think about what things will look like moving forward. I also think in terms of, hearing from players and things like that, that first week after Franklin got fired, we were hearing from four-year and 5-year guys, team captains, guys who have, been through it all with James Franklin. Talk about the guys we talked to this week. Ethan Grunkemeyer, Luke Reynolds are second-year players. Nolan Rucci had a long relationship with James Franklin, but he's in his second year at the program. Zion Tracy is a junior. I think we talked to some younger guys that, maybe when you're that young, you might not know any better, or just things might roll off you a little bit more. Just something that is a little bit different, maybe in how you respond to things based on age. I think that's something that you can really factor into it too. And I think also one thing to kind of get that sense is that there weren't really a lot of questions about James Franklin this week to players. So it wasn't necessarily something that, we were talking about that was really, top of mind, bringing up those sorts of emotions. I think the fact that it is Ohio State this week, that's like a big enough deal in itself. And that a team that has not played well faces a huge uphill challenge in a tough environment. I think that that's something that can maybe eclipse some of these feelings that are now more than 2 weeks away.
Yeah, getting away from the players to the coaches. And we spoke with Anthony Poindexter today on Thursday earlier with the Zoom call. Daniel was on there with me. And I asked him, what are you thinking about, moving forward with your career? And like you would expect, he's basically saying, trying to do the best we can over the next 5 games, and we'll get to the rest when we get to it. All these guys know this may be toward the end of the line for their time in State College. And if it isn't, it's going to be looking pretty different from an organizational structure and who might be the head coach and all that. But these guys have a job to do. Then they have players that they're accountable to. They have a head coach and an athletic director they're accountable to. And so coming out of a bye week, Mark, when you talk about post-bye week adjustments with 5 games remaining, chance for this team to do something, to show some success here in Big Ten play, what stands out to you at the top of your list that you're looking for Saturday in Columbus?
Terry Smith saying they need to establish the running game, that whoever runs the ball better is going to win the game. I think that is a recipe for success every year in every game, just about in the Big Ten. I mean, you have an Ohio State team that's allowing 2.8 yards per carry, has been very good against the run. You have a Penn State team that's strength was supposed to be the ground game with 2 very highly touted running backs coming into the season and what we thought was going to be one of the best offensive lines. So I love the fact that he's talking about getting back to basics. And I love the fact that he's saying, we're going to run play action. He's telling them what they're going to do. And that's challenging his guys. I love that. I mean, you're in a position where you have nothing to lose. Why not challenge those offensive linemen and running backs and say, hey, we're putting it on you. You need to get it done. We have a young quarterback. If we can't run the ball, we're not going to win the game. I love that. I think it's great. You're projecting to everybody what you're going to do. I don't think any of us here, you guys tell me if you think I'm wrong, think that that's some kind of smokescreen, that they're going to come out and be throwing the ball all over the place. I think they are going to look to establish the run and work off of that. And I think it's about time. To me, it's about time that they've done that.
Katron Allen, career high 28 carries last week, 5 more than at any point in his career, which is a long one. 145 yards, a career high for him, a couple touchdowns on the ground. We saw a little bit of Nick Singleton, but it was largely the Katron Allen show in that regard. Daniel, how about you when you look either side of the ball, whether it's more offense over to defense, on what this team needs to do differently than what we saw through the first 7 matchups, and that you're curious if we get an early look at that against Ohio State?
I think the easy answer is a little bit the inverse of Mark's, is that can this defense stop the run? We saw Iowa really, have their way on the ground beyond just Mark Gronowski. I think Kamari Moulton, the running back, had a pretty nice game out in Iowa City too. I think that Julian Sayin might not necessarily be the same type of runner that Gronowski was. So maybe that'll look a little bit different. But Ohio State has 3 good running backs back there. CJ Donaldson, James Peoples, and then Bo Jackson, the freshman who we saw camp here, I think, at least once during the recruiting process. And so if you're Penn State up front, you're going to need to be able to contain those guys, because it's a very similar thing where if you let Ohio State establish the run on you, that opens up play action. And I know that the talking point has been, don't let those wide receivers get behind you. But if a safety takes one wrong step, those guys can get behind you and really make you pay. So I think that, given what we've seen from this Penn State offense and their defense this season, we need to see them stop the run against Ohio State.
This isn't a situation to air the ball out early and often. As Mark said, they need to lead with the ground game. Terry Smith has made that clear when he said, if they don't outrush Ohio State, it will be a long afternoon for them. Those were his words on Wednesday evening. But I am curious, how much does Terry Smith's very public commentary about wanting to get more vertical with the pass attack versus the horizontal nature that we've seen so frequently, how does that show up in this game? Whether it's in the play action pass game or whether it's letting Ethan Grunkemeyer air it out occasionally. Very curious about that, because we talked about the influx of some young receiver talent maybe and giving you an infusion of something there. We'll see if that makes an impact. But ultimately, I think you want Ethan Grunkemeyer comfortable, and you want him avoiding big mistakes, and you want him to maintain that poise. We'll talk more about him. But do we see Andy Kotelnicki dial up some plays that try to stretch the Ohio State defense a bit, add a new wrinkle to this offense that's just been glaringly lacking? And, it led to a pass interference penalty against Iowa. We didn't see a big connection down the field. They only threw for 90 yards. But when you had the last couple of weeks to get into your lab, and Terry Smith's coming out of that and saying, we got to throw the ball vertically, I want to see if that translates in the first game that follows that. When you talk about the practice look that we got, it was in Holuba Hall on Wednesday evening. Nothing earth-shattering for us, but it was a notable day for taking attendance, I thought, guys, because we got to look at some players who returned from the absences. And you had your eyes on offense, so we'll start with you, Daniel. Venga Ioane back in the mix. Cooper Cousins out there. He's a guy who's been limited or out for much of Big Ten play. What does the return of Venga Ioane, in your opinion, do for this team?
Yeah, I think that's your best offensive lineman this season. Venga is such a big presence, physically, and I think also the way that he plays also brings a little bit to that line as well. I've been impressed with what we've seen from TJ Shanahan in some spot duty. Like, he got the start last week or 2 weeks ago at Iowa with Ioane out. But Venga Ioane is just a different type of guy that you have in there, compared to someone like Shanahan. So I think that's big, for Penn State, especially when you're going to be, this is one of those games where it's a lot about coaching, but you're going to be going up against a bunch of 4 and 5 stars on the other side. And you need your guys who are the 4 and 5 stars and your, physical freaks, on the freaks list to really play like that. I think Ioane is one of those guys.
We've seen trench battles cost Penn State dearly in this matchup in years past, whether it was an inability to establish the run or early or put the game away late. That comes to mind as well in some of these opportunities they've had. Mark, over at quarterback, things have gotten thinned out pretty fast with Drew Aller on the sideline for the remainder of the season. Jackson Smolik got his first game action since September of 2023. out in Iowa, carried the ball a few times, ended up walking off the field with his left wrist, left hand, and kind of a ice wrap. Looked like he's still managing through that based on our latest look on Wednesday, which could set the stage for Beckham Kritza, who we just saw on the practice field involved for the first time since August. He's been dealing with his own injury issue. He's been out in these pregame availability reports. Terry Smith did give us a heads up that was not going to be the case moving forward, but did it look like to you that we may be one snap away from seeing Beckham Kritza holding the rudder of this offense in Columbus?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I like Kritza. I think he's got an upside, but they brought him in thinking he was going to be a guy that was going to take a year. If you look at him physically, he's like 6'8", 172 pounds. I'm joking, but I mean, he is a really tall, and we saw him a bunch of times in person. I mean, up close and personal at the Elite 11 here. And I mean, he's every bit. What is he listed at? 6'6". I mean, he's every bit of 6'6".
I think they've got him at 6'5", 200. But I think he's taller than where Drew Aller was, and Drew Aller's listed at 6'5" as well.
Right, and he's not much over 200 even now,
Right.
even after he enrolled early. So he's a thin kid. He has a big arm, but that will be a very, very difficult situation. So I wonder, going back, hindsight being 2020. I just wonder how smart it was to play both of those quarterbacks out at Iowa. And again, I am saying this hindsight being 2020 because you were in a position out there where you had a walk-on, Jack Lambert, who was your third-team guy who was traveling. So what sense did it make to put both of those guys in harm's way? Looking at Smolik on the field, I don't know what he's got going on that hand. It's like a big flap or flipper or something. That does not look like a guy who's going to be ready to play this weekend.
He was wearing a glove and his fingers were not in the glove.
Right, didn't it
on the
look
left
like a
hand.
flipper, didn't it? I mean, so we have photos of it, and I'm looking. I'm like, what the heck is going on there? And I hope for his sake. I always say this, knock on wood. I hope everybody's okay. But yeah, I think your second team QB is going to be a true freshman, and I wonder. And I don't think this is a question Terry would have answered for strategic purposes. But after I got done watching practice, I'm thinking, is their second team QB really going to be Singleton and Catron, running Wildcat? Because I think that would be a very difficult spot to put a true freshman in. Somebody who needs to be developed. And I think you would risk maybe impacting him long term. I mean, we saw Taquan Roberson get into a position at Iowa that I never thought he was going to recover from that at Penn State. And he's gone on and played other places at lower levels, and I think things have been okay for him. But I don't know that you would want to do that to a kid. And I know I'm projecting here and thinking what if, but I really wonder if they don't have a different plan if something happens to Grunk.
Everyone says the right things about Kritza when we asked him this week, and he's a guy that he's doing good things. He's been accountable, but where is the trust? Where is the confidence from the staff? Because they didn't even let him go out and throw passes in the blue-white game back in April. Jack Lambert was out there, the walk-on, but we didn't see Kritza involved. And then he comes out of preseason camp banged up, so we haven't seen him even on the practice field, connecting with receivers, working under the tutelage of his coaches. I don't know maybe what was able to be done while he was managing the injury that we didn't see, but during our 10 to 15-minute windows for the first 2 months of the year, this is the first time we've seen him involved in this way. So, yeah, you're asking a lot. All of a sudden, I have to imagine, I may be wrong here, but if Smolik is not available, that 2 QB plan goes away, gets tucked away on the side for at least this week against Ohio State. But again,
people were talking. I mean, there were people talking about Reynolds, going in there and play. So there are other options. There are guys who have played QB, but I just think it would be a real risk for that kid's future. And is it worth it to mortgage his future against? If he's in the game at that point, it's going to be a difficult situation no matter when it is. So I don't know. I guess we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's a conversation I think none of us hope that we have to have on Saturday afternoon, but that it could be a reality that sets in along the course of a 4-quarter game. Daniel, circling back to the offensive line, we addressed who was back and who was available, but you noted that there was maybe some tweaking going on for Phil Trautwein, for Andy Kotelnicki, and we already talked about how Terry Smith was going to take the bye week in a way that he couldn't really ahead of the Iowa game to maybe take a longer look at some of these position competitions, the snap distributions. What can you pass along to us on the podcast?
Yeah, so like we said, the practice was in Holuba Hall, so the setup is a little bit different. Things are done in a little bit different pattern, things like that. So I didn't see a full 5 look from the offensive line, but they are divided into right side and left side. And the first guys through on the right side, you had Anthony Donka at right tackle, TJ Shanahan at right guard. When the second group went through, it was Cooper Cousins at right guard, Nolan Rucci at right tackle. As most of our viewers know, it's been Donka at right guard and Rucci at right tackle for much of the season. So that's something that is a little bit different. Shanahan started the past 3 games. Like I said, he was at left guard against Iowa. He was at right guard against UCLA and Northwestern. That was with Donka, got banged up a little bit and I think was either questionable or unavailable for. No, it was just questionable for the UCLA game. So that's something a little bit different. We'll see what this looks like. I really like Donka as a right tackle. I know that the big selling point on him when he came in was that he was a guard and he has that guard flexibility. But for whatever reason, that just didn't quite seem like it was working in the same fashion through the first couple of weeks of the year. So that'll be something a little bit different potentially when we get out to Columbus.
Over across the trenches, some good news to report from my look over at the defensive side of things. You saw Zariah Fisher back in uniform, full go as far as we could tell. Same deal for Jalen Harvey. Again, we didn't get a 11-on-11 look here, but both of those guys were going through defensive end drills. Both of them were working against some scout team offensive linemen and some physical contact. So looks like, just as Terry Smith projected for Zariah Fisher, we didn't get him on the record on Monday regarding Jalen Harvey, but looks like he'll have those guys involved in the plan. Remember, Fisher was sidelined during the Iowa game. He started all 7 games opposite of Denai Dennis Sutton. According to Pro Football Focus, he ranked 2nd on the team in pressures produced. And then Jalen Harvey's largely been a second string backup contributor. And so you want all hands on deck as best you can in the trenches against Ohio State. We'll see how that impacts Grunkemeyer, who got a lot of work, almost 30 snaps against Iowa with those guys sidelined, and Chaz Coleman, of course, still in the conversation as well. I'll pass along one more note. Enai White, who we talked about earlier in preseason camp, making a transition from defensive end to defensive tackle. Now, back-to-back weeks, we've seen him working at defensive end again, listed at 6'5", 280 pounds. He's pretty far removed from being a former top 100 prospect out of the Philadelphia area. He's a redshirt junior now, but maybe somebody else they'll throw out there. I asked about him directly to Terry Smith after practice Wednesday, and he essentially said they've got to find ways to stop the run. They've got to do that across the defensive front. They think that maybe he gives him a chance to do that at defensive end, and you understand why they'd be searching for solutions, ranked 16th in the conference against the run. Guys, when we look over at Ohio State, it's difficult to ignore the talent that they have on the field. They're the reigning national champions, and there has been a lot of respect paid to the weapons that they have in the past game. Terry Smith said, quote, "We've got to stop the 2 best receivers in college football and the hottest quarterback in college football." So we'll get to Jim Knowles in a second because that's the task at hand. But Julian Sayin is 80% passing, first-year starting quarterback for Ohio State. I believe he's over 300 pass yards in 4 of the last 6 games, and they haven't really had to play him and pass in these games deep into the fourth quarter at any point because of the margins of victory. But, Mark, let's be realistic. This is always a huge test for Penn State, man-to-man, unit-to-unit against this Buckeye squad. And right now, based on how Penn State has performed for 7 games, there's just no margin for error in a game like this. How scary is this situation against Penn State's or against Ohio State's QB and top 2 wide receivers in Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith?
Yeah, I mean, Terry Smith said you can't let those guys get behind you. I would argue that the biggest key for the Penn State defense is getting pressure on Sayin. I mean, and I think we all could agree that Penn State's pass rush has not been what any of us expected it to be. Denai Dennis Sutton, his sack numbers aren't where we thought they would be. He's done a good job of getting pressure Zane Durant hasn't made the plays in the backfield that we were expecting. And overall, in Big Ten play, 4 games, I think they have 5 sacks, Penn State, and that's just not what this team needs. And if they are unable to pressure Sand, a guy who isn't going to beat you with his feet, it is going to be a long, long, long day, because then all those other matchups that you're talking about could become that much more difficult. How do you keep, as you mentioned earlier, Tyler, how do you keep the Smith and Tate, in front of you if the quarterback isn't pressured? Sooner or later, they're going to get behind you. So I just think Penn State has got to find a way. Jim Knowles has got to find a way to dial up pressure. And I don't know if that's coaxing more out of your defensive ends. I don't know if that's trying to blitz, which would seem to go counter to not letting guys get behind you. It's tough. It's not easy, but I mean, that's why Ohio State's as good as they are. I mean, from everything we've heard, talking to people in Columbus, there are real questions. I mean, you could see it from the outside looking in about the consistency of the ground game. So, to me, you kind of take your chances there, and you have to try to get pressure somehow, some way on that quarterback, because he's completing 80% of his passes. I mean, that's just an ungodly number. And if he does that this weekend, it's going to be big trouble for Penn State.
Yeah, Carnell Tate's been a field stretcher, averaging more than 17 yards per catch. We talked about it earlier this week with Patrick Murphy. You got Jeremiah Smith, who's going to go down as one of the all-time great receivers in college football history. He's made clutch plays. He's made consistent plays. He's averaging essentially a touchdown per game through his career in a season and a half. Daniel, I know that you heard from Zion Tracy, starting defensive back for this unit. Obviously, these guys are on his radar. Anything to add? Because we've heard it time and time again, but Tracy's a guy who's right there trying to study up, trying to prepare for an enormous test on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really, really tough task for these guys, but I think the one thing that about defensive backs is that they don't play scared, that there's a lot of confidence, and you have to have that if you play that position, because you're on an island. Yeah, if you make a mistake, everyone can see it. You got to bounce back and move forward. Terry Smith said, he was like, asked him about Jeremiah Smith, and he's like, yeah, like he would have been a top 3 pick in the draft last year. He'd be a top 3 pick in the draft this year, and he'll probably be a top 3 pick in the draft in 2027 when he can finally be eligible. So I think that, Penn State knows, like, everyone is on their radar. They know what's ahead of them. And I think this is one of those things where you really have to play that complementary football at all 3 levels of the defense if you want to have a chance.
When we look over to Jim Knowles now, because let's face it, this is not how he thought he'd be returning to Columbus. I'd imagine he anticipated a heavyweight showdown, probably thought his defense would be rolling along, momentum would be going right. That has not been the case. And we've documented how the defense has let down this Penn State squad in some of these defeats, and they certainly bear plenty of the blame, just as we've laid on the offense over the course of this season. Mark, when you look at Jim Knowles heading back, we heard Terry Smith say he certainly has some insight and perspective on the way Ryan Day thinks over the course of a game, and some of the decision-making and some of the strategizing he might make. And Ryan Day knows Jim Knowles pretty well too, and so does much of this Ohio State staff. I think you throw a lot of it out the window, but internal motivation and also the ability to maybe change some things that have not gone well through the first 4 games of Big Ten ball. How much is this to you an opportunity to judge Jim Knowles, not just because he's going on the road and facing his former team that he left to take the Penn State job, but because he's coming out of a bye week, and if his back is against the wall, and if he doesn't feel that way in terms of how to utilize this defense, I think it's fair to wonder what the internal conversation is within that defensive room right now.
Yeah, especially when you compare them to what's going on at Ohio State. I mean, they bring in Patricia, and they're number 1 in the nation in total defense. So apparently it doesn't have to be the most complicated defense in the world. Either that or Ohio State has the smartest players in the history of football. And I'm not knocking Ohio State players. I'm sure they're very smart. But, to me, you can't question, Terry Smith called Knowles, the mad scientist or whatever. You can't question his intelligence or what he's capable of doing. What you can question is it's one thing to be a super genius. It's another thing to teach people. So, and they don't always go hand in hand. And I think he had to take a step back during that bye week and adjust him. I mean, he had to adjust what he was doing and no longer expect the players to figure out what he was trying to teach them. I know that may sound a little crazy, but at some point, if the players aren't absorbing it, you're failing as a coach. And we know he's a better coach than that. So I think it's about getting back to basics again, which is a cliche, but when you're in this sort of funk that they're in, it does make sense to kind of lean back on old reliable. So yeah, to me, I'm hearing a lot about this revenge factor. The Ohio State, are they going to take it? I mean, they've already won that, haven't they? I mean, they've already made their point. What are you going to do? Kick him when he's down? So yeah, I think this is a really big game for Jim Knowles to show that not only is he super smart, but he's able to project that to players. And let's face it, this wasn't like a young Penn State defense, right? Like there were young players in certain spots, but you had a lot of veteran players on this defense. So I think them being able to understand what he wants them to do is key for this week, obviously.
Yeah, and maybe speaking of young players, will we see some of them involved at linebacker, or do you just do what you've done during this losing streak and give 99% of the snaps to Dom DeLuca alongside Amari Campbell, and you just live and die with that concept? Or does a guy like Alex Tash poke his head into the conversation, get a little bit of defensive work? Something I'll personally be kind of monitoring on Saturday, like many of us will. Daniel, I don't know if you had anything to add on Jim Knowles, but if you do, let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Matt Patricia is a huge winner in all of this. The feedback on him coming out of Columbus has been very positive, and you think about how that hire was received by people in our space and the reputation that he had put together in the NFL. I was thinking about it, like I was covering the Eagles when they got Darius Slay in 2020, and he came in, and the big thing with him was that he was coming to Philadelphia because he'd had huge beef with Matt Patricia, and so I think that this is something that not a lot of us thought would go as well as it has at Ohio State. So it's interesting, so many different ways to make things work, and I think that there's a lot of other things going on in college football right now, but I think it's probably one of the more underrated storylines is Matt Patricia and how well that's worked.
It makes it a bigger pill to swallow for the Penn State community, because if you had Jim Knowles and they were struggling defensively, you'd still be upset about that. But if you look back in Columbus and saw, well, they've fallen off a little bit defensively, they're not what they were. Instead, they've taken steps forward from where they were during the national championship run. It's just a tough combination to deal with, and in an era where Ohio State's had the upper hand on Penn State for a while now. But another homecoming occurring of a different variety. Ethan Grunkemeyer played high school ball not too far away from Ohio Stadium. He's a guy that acknowledged earlier this week that he dreamed of getting a chance to play there. Ohio State certainly kept tabs on him. They were engaged with him at different points, more so later on in his process as a recruit. But there was never a scholarship offer on the table. They had their guide, and they had five-star guy committed, Dylan Raiola, and they ended up going a different direction at the end of the process and still found a blue-chip guy. But, Daniel, what have you gathered? Because I know that we've had a chance to talk to some people around State College about Ethan Grunkemeyer, but in between our practice availability sessions yesterday, you went out to your car, sat down and chatted with his high school coach as well for some extra perspective. I know you've got a story coming up to Lions247.com that I encourage people to check out. But in podcast form here, what do we need to know about the path of Ethan Grunkemeyer and some of the things that happened along the way that make this opportunity notable for him?
Yeah, I think some of it is similar to what we've talked about in terms of him being a little bit of a late bloomer in the recruiting process. There was a coaching change at Olentangy High School. They shifted to an offense that spotlighted his skills a little bit more, and then that's when he took off. Of course, at that point, Ohio State had Dylan Raiola committed, and there was, I think, a little bit of a missed connection aspect of it. Ships passing in the night, where when Grunkemeyer might have been ready Ohio State already had a guy. When Ohio State needed a guy, Grunkemeyer wasn't ready, that sort of thing. But I think overall, just in terms of the homecoming aspect, it's a very sort of all-American story. When you talk about hometown kid going home to play on the biggest stage. I talked to Olentangy coach Wade Bartholomew for about 15 minutes on Wednesday evening, and he said that he's going to the game. He's taking his wife. He's taking his daughters. They're going to go see Grunkemeyer play. That he's heard from teachers in the school that he might not necessarily talk to, who might not have interest in football. They're saying that they're going to be tuned into the game on Saturday to see Grunkemeyer play. I think that he was that sort of presence at that school, and someone who the teachers, faculty, everyone had a lot of appreciation for. Bartholomew also said that it's just beyond their high school, that he's hearing from people in the school district. And that's a pretty big school district north in the northern suburbs that has put out some pretty good football players the last couple of years. So he's hearing from people at Olentangy Liberty, Olentangy Orange, that they're going to be watching Ethan Grunkemeyer at Ohio State on Saturday. And so he talked about Grunkemeyer as someone who's really determined, has a really good work ethic, and is really demanding. I think that one of the things that we've been trying to do is pin down the Grunkemeyer's personality a little bit, because we haven't had a ton of exposure to him in media settings. And when we have, he's a pretty low-key guy. I wouldn't necessarily call him low energy, but he's thoughtful. He's very dry, very businesslike in his media interactions. But we're hearing about how he's a really big jokester in the locker room, has a sense of humor, but then on the field is really demanding. That was one of the things that I heard from his high school coach, is that he wants to make sure everyone has it together when they're out there. He wants to make sure everyone's in the right space, and that serves him well. His high school coach said that when he saw him on TV out at Iowa, that it was pretty much what he expected to see. Someone who's not going to make mistakes, someone who is engaged pre-snap, is going to make sure all of that is run well. And then, you can make some plays with his legs, with his arm after that. So I think is a pretty good portrait. I'm going to try to meld all that together with some of the feedback we got from Grunkemeyer this week. He called it a dream come true to get to go play at Ohio Stadium. And it's a fun storyline. We'll see how fun it is halfway through the second quarter. But for right now, in terms of connections and things like that, I think it's pretty neat.
As we said earlier in the week, when Terry Smith was asked about what's the next step for Ethan after his first start, he didn't really talk about Ethan. He talked about the coaching staff, putting the pieces around him, putting the structure around him in a game like this to have success. So I think they have a lot of confidence in who he is in this moment. And we'll see if that poise, I think yesterday night when I talked to Luke Reynolds, he said that he's unfazed by everything. If that can hold up for another road game, that would be pretty important for Penn State to have a fighting chance on the road to make this a competitive matchup. Let's talk about our players to watch, and we're going to go right back to you, Daniel. I think Ethan Grunkemeyer is obviously a guy to watch, but I think maybe you'll go in a different direction this time around.
Yeah, I'm going to go with another Ohio native, Chaz Coleman. This is the type of game where you talk about, going up against the passing game where you want to get their quarterback off their spot. You want to make sure that he doesn't have time to pick you apart. Need your pass rushers to show up, and that's something that in the limited Chaz Coleman sample size, that's something that Penn State will trust him to do. Terry Smith said that we didn't see much of him against Iowa because they knew that Iowa was going to run the ball. That goes back to what we heard from Jim Knowles during the bye week, that they had all the confidence in the world in Chaz Coleman as a pass rusher, but he needed some work as a run defender. We know that Ohio State can run the ball if they want to, but they're going to try to throw. And if you want to get Julian Sayin off his spot, make things difficult for him, I think having someone like Chaz Coleman that you can throw out, if you get him in 3rd and long, throw Chaz Coleman out there, let him go after the quarterback.
Mark, which Penn State player are you putting in the spotlight here?
Same position, but a different player. Denied Dennis Sutton last 5 games, 1 tackle for loss, no sacks. You could argue that he's being held, but the great ones are always held. He's a really good player, and he's better than what we've seen from him. This is his opportunity to break out, and they're going to need him to break out. As much as I like a young Chaz Coleman, I think for Penn State to win this game, it's going to have a dominating effort from a guy like Denai Dennis Sutton with at least a couple of sacks. That's not my bold prediction. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I think he's got to elevate it regardless if he's getting double teamed, regardless if he's getting held. We've seen it in the past. The best Penn State players overcome that stuff. The best pass rushers, they may be a little bit frustrated, but ultimately break out of it. So they're going to need him to be consistently good throughout the game. And then when the game's on the line, maybe come through with a big play or two. So Denai Dennis Sutton is my man.
You took Denai off my plate. I was going to go there. I've got something on Chaz Coleman for my prediction. I'm going to go with Katron Allen, though. I'll shift over to him. Normally, he's been part of the conversation here on the podcast much of the season in terms of why aren't they getting him involved more? Why aren't they treating him like a priority? They did that against Iowa. And in a lot of ways, he was the guy who kept the ball rolling and kept the ball rolling forward and gave them a chance to really put some things together in that game and take a lead late in that game and really keep things stable for Ethan Grunkemeyer, keep the chains moving and be in manageable down and distance situations. So if you can apply that to this Ohio State game, again, can you give yourself a shot to get into the fourth quarter of this game, 15 minutes left, and feel like you could maybe make an impact? Like you can have people tuning into this game and either feeling proud about how Penn State is playing or feel scared about the way Penn State is playing if they're from the Ohio State angle. And to me, if they get to that point through 45 minutes of football, it's because Katron Allen remains the catalyst on offense. I don't see Ethan Grunkemeyer, again, throwing for 3 touchdowns and 300 yards over the course of this game. They need Katron Allen to help them get avoid 2nd and 8s, 3rd and 8s, and make them 2nd and 2s, 3rd and 2s. And it's pretty amazing that we can get through all this conversation this week. And even in our prediction piece up at Lions 24/7, Mark, you noted, Nick Singleton's like a ghost in the conversation now. No one's talking about him. Don't discount him playing a role, because that's another thing that we heard from Terry Smith, getting him in space, getting the ball in space. That's a priority. That's on the agenda offensively. But I'm not going to Nick Singleton here based on the 7-game sample size we have. I want to see Katron Allen get 20-plus carries again, ride him as much as you need to. He's a guy who I think lives for moments like these, and curious to see how he responds. Ohio State not giving much up on the ground. They got a lot of tackles for loss. Katron Allen is the guy. I think he had 28 carries against Iowa, like I said. None of them resulted in lost yardage. So that's going to be imperative for Penn State to be able to lean on him again in this matchup. Let's get to our predictions portion and close out the show on this. We'll give you our score prediction and our bold prediction. And Mark, we go with you first.
Yeah, Terry Smith came up with this phrase this week that I never heard from the coach of a big-time college football program. It's called chopping wood. It's this thing where you just keep grinding and grinding and grinding, and maybe things are going to go the right way. He talked about
Mark's kidding, folks, because I lived in an environment for 3 years where this was hammered into our heads on a daily basis, and we wore wristbands that had the word "chop" on them. So Mark's saying this.
I had never heard it before.
Piscataway, New Jersey. Yeah. No.
No, in all seriousness, I do think Penn State's going to play well. I think I have a gut feeling that Penn State's buying into what Terry Smith is selling, and that may not come across the right way, but I think he's the right man to help guide him through this. I just think this is a situation where even if things go right for Penn State, Ohio State is so talented that it's going to have to do multiple things wrong for Penn State to have an opportunity to win. I think Penn State will have a chance to keep it, to stay in the game, but I'm looking at Ohio State, and I mentioned this earlier this week when I was putting my prediction together. I think they're first in the Big Ten in fewest number of penalty yards, if that makes sense, in Big Ten play, and have only committed 1 turnover in Big Ten play. For Penn State to have an opportunity, those things would have to change in a big way. And I think Ohio State has given us enough a body of work that we're not going to see that happen. So I don't think Ohio State's going to cover. I'm going 31-14 Ohio State. My bold prediction, Ohio State has like no tape on Kobe Howard, like none. Like, well, maybe from one game. So they have
films out there, Mark. There's plenty of practice film out on social media.
Where did that come from? I don't even know. But no, listen, we've heard that they're going to give this kid in Tyseer Denmark an opportunity, and I think he's going to take advantage of it. He had his first catch against Ohio State. First career catch as a freshman at Ohio State at Iowa last week, 2 weeks ago, for a team high 14 yards, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around. I think he gets into the end zone this week. I think Kobe Howard scores a touchdown for his first career TD at the college level, and the Lions will chop wood, but they won't quite get the tree all the way down.
Daniel, what do we have from you?
When we started recording the podcast and I was putting my notes together, it popped into my head that I made a pretty big show in the preseason of saying I wasn't going to pick Penn State to beat Ohio State under any circumstances, given what we've seen the past couple of years. That was in the context of Penn State going 11-1 in this season. So I'm sticking to my guns there. I have Ohio State winning 30-13. I don't think the Buckeyes cover. I think this is one of those games where we see Penn State come out and play really inspired in the early going, and it goes into halftime tied 10-10. Penn State gets a big special teams play. I'll call it another deny Dennis Sutton block to give the Nittany Lions a short field for a touchdown. But ultimately, I guess this is my bold. I segued into the bold prediction. Ultimately, though, Ohio State pulls away in the second half. Jeremiah Smith scores 2 touchdowns in the final 30 minutes, and that 10-10 tie turns into that 30-13 loss. It's really hard for me to see Penn State coming out flat in this game, but you can only, I think, play off that sort of emotion for so long, and we know that this Penn State team is flawed. So I think that it's going to be a question of when, not if, those flaws rear their head over the course of Saturday afternoon.
You gave us a couple bold predictions there. Deny getting another punt block is a pretty good one as well, Daniel. And I kind of follow a similar logic as you. I do think this game gets to halftime, and you guys can tell me because you'll be out there, but I think Ohio Stadium will be a little quiet. I think there'll be some angst. Let's face it, those fans, seriously, they expect perfection. They nitpick this team, and I think they'll not love the way things have gone on the scoreboard through the first half. I don't necessarily think Penn State will be winning, but I think it'll just look choppier for Ohio State. I think Penn State maybe will the body language, just kind of raw eye view, will look like Penn State's bringing a little more enthusiasm to the game. If that's not the case, then credit to Ryan Day for having his team ready, regardless of who the opponent is, regardless of what they're bringing to the field. But I also believe that they will pull away. I think the Ohio State's much maligned run game in Columbus will find something in the second half. I just can't give the benefit of the doubt to this Penn State run defense to keep Ohio State bottled up. I have a lot of respect for their offensive line. They've got weapons in the backfield. Bo Jackson is a guy averaging 6 yards per carry, has the name to match it. And I think when you look over the course, I just think it's more likely that Ohio State gets into that long-awaited rhythm on the ground than it is that they'll be stifled by the Big Ten 16th ranked run defense over the course of the second half here. Ultimately, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Julian Sayin, they're going to get theirs. I just don't see Penn State having the firepower. Again, the benefit of the doubt is certainly not there, that they'll be able to answer some of those body blows and haymakers that they'll get dished to by the Ohio State offense. So I think ultimately gets away from them, turns into a 3-possession game. I've got it 34-17 Ohio State. But if I'm not mistaken, we've all got a 17-point margin, which means we all have Penn State covering. They did not cover the spread through their first 6 games of this season. Their first game with Terry Smith at Iowa was the first time they have covered the spread. We've got them doing it in back-to-back games if you're looking for any kind of silver lining or moral victory or maybe gambling insight from us on this prediction. But my bold prediction beyond the 34-17 score is Chaz Coleman getting involved with his first time Big Ten sack. We saw him come up with the strip sack and return in non-conference play where he really flashed in a lot of things and validated so much of the preseason conversation, but it's been pretty quiet. We know he was dealing with an illness at some point in October, limited him a bit. Then last week they wanted to prepare for a run-heavy offense against Iowa, and so it was less of him. But I think he'll get some run here back home in Ohio. The Buckeyes made a late push for him. Penn State was a huge recruiting win for them not to let that happen. And I think that you get another look at Chaz Coleman on a big stage. And this is an Ohio State team that has given up only 3 sacks through 7 games. So I think that would make it even more bold if Chaz Coleman was to take down Julian Sayin in the backfield over the course of Saturday afternoon. Guys, appreciate the conversation. You two will be heading west, and we'll get your perspective from the stadium. Make sure you're following our pregame coverage well ahead of kickoff on Saturday over at Lions247.com. We'll also get into it after this game with the postgame podcast and coverage out of Columbus from Daniel and Mark. On behalf of these guys, I am Tyler Donahue. Thanks as always for listening or watching with us on the Lions 24/7 podcast.